So yes, as Nina said, my name is Oida Udiani. I'm newest postdoc in NIMBioS, and I just first wanted to start by thanking you guys. You guys have been very hospitable, hosting me these past few weeks, and really excited about the potential of doing good, amazing work and collaborating with you guys. So thank you. That's fine. Okay, so since this is my first talk, I thought I would start by saying a bit about what the kinds of things I'm interested in research-wise. And they generally revolve around systems. So we live in a world of systems, and these systems are defined by their complexity, their social complexity. And by that, I mean they're often composed of social actors who are interacting in ways that produce behavior that sometimes you can't necessarily understand by just looking at the components by themselves. These social complexity has consequences for understanding behavior of these systems. So from economic systems, trying to understand how markets evolve with time, ecosystems, management of ecosystems, and so that you don't get things like forest fires, right? And other things. So my research interest really revolves around trying to use mathematical modeling tools to understand how these systems are organized from the ground level up, and how they might be regulated using just simple rules at the individual level. And this work generally involves tools of nonlinear dynamics. This is primarily where I did my dissertation work. At NIMBioS, I'm going to be incorporating a bit more tools from game theory, which is this deal with the strategic interactions between rational agents. And then there are also computational approaches. So sometimes you want to investigate the effects of heterogeneity, and you want to use computational tools or agent-based models. And so I hope that through a combination of these approaches, I can better understand these kinds of systems. Okay. So as you probably guessed from today's talk, I'm going to be talking about animals. Right, and my interest in social animals from Arizona State, where I did my dissertation work, was really motivated by the diversity. So if you look in the animal world, social groups vary. So down here from these groups of unrelated male penguins huddling for warmth in Antarctica, purpose of keeping their offspring from freezing to death. Right, all the way up to social insects, the ants and the bees, which are these massive colonies comprised of females and sterile females who cooperate for tasks needed to raise their siblings. Okay, and one of the interesting paradoxes of sociality is this, that even though social animals are quite successful, they're evolutionarily rare. So in the case of ants, right, ants and probably the social insects actually comprise less than 2% of all the insects that we know on Earth, but yet are responsible for about a third more of the biomass. So like I said, it's very successful, but rare. And one of the reasons, it's an interesting question, and one that motivates a lot of research in social biology. And one component of that is for why these animals are successful is how they organize around work. Okay, and what do I mean by work? So my brother, who's a physics major, when I tell him about the kind of stuff I do, and I say I'm interested in work and task organization, this is what he immediately thinks, right? So it's Sisyphus, pushing the boulder up the hill, and he imagines all these forces acting on it and trying to understand what are the consequences on his ability to do it. Well, biology looks at the same picture and looks inside, so at the coordinations of cells that makes up the tissues and the organs and muscles that allow biological entities to to survive, grow, and reproduce. And that's really what task organization work is in social groups, and what task organization is about. It's about how groups can regulate their activities and respond not only to the internal pressures that arise, but also in response to external changes. Okay? So my work really focuses on harvest ants, seed harvest ants. These ants are interesting for two reasons. One, they're easy to study, and when you're doing a dissertation, that's really important, right? But they also live in two very unique contexts. So as a colony, the workers operate as like cells in the body, right? And the workers, they work for the good of the colony. And I'm going to talk about a project about collective foraging where this shows up. But also, they also live as cooperative, in cooperative groups. So during the early parts of the colony, the queens cooperate for tasks needed to start to raise the first cohort of workers. And when we think about how, even in these two contexts, when we think about how they are related, mathematical models have been useful in trying to understand how ants, for instance, can actually organize to do work. And it all revolves around this idea of, again, this complex systems thinking of self-organization. So the context you're thinking about is one where you have individuals interacting using very simple rules. So they might vary in their response to information about different tasks, right? And then their interactions typically have two sides, a positive and negative side. And through reinforcement, you can generate group level outcomes. So the paradigmatic example of this is the response threshold model. And it goes something like this, right? So just imagine a social group here. Listed a couple of ants, right? And in this case, we've got two tasks which I've identified that have a stimulus associated with them, right? And the individuals have response thresholds characteristic to them, and I've divided them into three groups. So the idea is that when one individual performs a task, her performance of it necessarily inhibits a stimulus from growing, and this feedback results, provided, of course, that she's efficient, the rate at which she works on a task is efficient to keep the stimulus from growing. This creates, or this will end up in an equilibrium organization where you've got different individuals performing different tasks, and you can imagine if a shock comes to the system so that the first task is now, there's more work in the second task, and the colony can easily adjust its allocation, okay? So this is an example of the kinds of models that have been used to describe how ant colonies self-organize around work. But there's no reason why self-organization mechanisms should be efficient, right? So in the example I just described earlier, there's no reason why these individuals here should be the most efficient individuals at those tasks. And in fact, when you look at studies that try to correlate division of labor in ant societies with productivity, it's not quite there. So there's still a lot of unknowns about how these systems are organized, and because colonies actually, they need to respond to the environment, and that's really one of what's motivating my interest in these systems. Okay. The other thing that's quite interesting, in addition to colonies being able to respond to the environment, is that the empirical evidence does show that there's behavior variations at multiple levels, and so you can have some individuals in the colony who tend to be more active or tend to be more social than other individuals, right? And it's not exactly clear, again, how the relationship between individual phenotypes affects colony phenotypes, such as the flexibility and robustness to perturbations in their environment, okay? And so this is where modeling is quite useful in conjunction with behavior experiments. And it's, my work has really, been about trying to understand three questions, like how do individuals make decisions, given the cost of those decisions in the colony, how these decisions relate to the size and mix of individuals in the group, and to understand the consequences for task organization, whether or not the group can respond to change. So for this talk, I'm going to talk about two primary contexts where the trade-off of individual flexibility and group robustness is important. Regarding to, so in the first one, I'm going to talk about foraging in mature colonies, and second one, division of labor in foundries associations, okay? So, like I said, ant colonies are organized from the ground level up. The workers are the ones who are responsible for the tasks for maintaining the colony. And the species I work with is Barbados, the red harvester ant, lives in the southwest of the United States. These are very, if anyone's ever been to Arizona, it gets really hot, and it's, it's rough out there, So, but these harvester ants have an interesting life history strategy. So they forage for seeds for both food and water. The way that works is they metabolize phytes from the seeds. So if they don't get seeds, they don't get food, they don't get water. So it's really bad. So it's really important for colonies to regulate their activity in response to changes both in temperature and also other, it's bad. Okay, and other ecological factors that they have to deal with. So this is what a typical colony might look like. I've highlighted in green here, where this is characteristic Barbados, right? So you have this clearing, and you can see this foraging trail that extends out, and that's how you can sort of identify them in the field, right? And so usually other colonies close by, they sometimes have overlapping territories, and they forage, again, they compete for seeds, okay? One thing that does happen is every once in a while, these guys show up, right? And they like to sit right here and pick up the foragers as they, leave and return. So the colony needs to know when, both in order not only to regulate its activity in response to changes in temperature, which will happen throughout the day, but it's going to face like short-term perturbations when these predators show up, and again needs to respond to that. Okay, and so one of my collaborators, Noah Pinto-Woman, who's now at UCLA, went out to the fields and did wonderful experiments, trying to understand what the mechanism is. How do colonies do this? Like, how do they get that information across? And what she found is that it depends on the interaction rate. So, there's three groups of foragers. There are available foragers who wait at the nest entrance, right? And she went and observed that using a video camera. She recorded the number of individuals who are waiting at the nest, and the number of individuals out going on the trail, returning on the trail, and did these perturbation experiments where, one, she placed seeds in front of the colony, and then monitored the number of foragers in each of these categories. So the first thing you can see very quickly, the colony. So this is sort of the activity before the perturbation, the arrival of food. And in a matter of less than a minute, you can sort of see the change in activity, right? And the result, and after about 14 minutes or so, here the seeds were depleted, and you can see the return to a different level of activity, lower level of activity. So the second experiment that she did was to do these perturbation experiments, right? Where she looked at these colonies who were already foraging at a reasonable level of activity, and then started removing the number of foragers, like removing foragers returning from outside, preventing them from going back into the nest. And she did that for 3 minutes and 10 minutes, and then observed the response of the colony to whether or not it can return to its previous level of activity. And what she found, quite interestingly, is that first, that there was a correlation between the rate of return of successful foragers and the activation of new foragers. So it's an interaction-based process that's occurring here. And then, ooh, okay. And the foragers also tend to change their behavior in the absence of information. Okay, so that based on the result here, that the colonies return to different levels of activity depending on the length of the perturbation, is that she deduced that the foragers who were returning here were the ones who were already at the nest entrance and ready to exit. Those are the ones who were returning, leaving after the perturbation for 3 minutes. But the ones who were showing up here were ones that actually got recruited from below the nest. Okay, so what this result sort of tells us is that there is the ways in which forager makes decisions, again, has this positive negative side. They're responding. Imagine like potential forager comes out and is sort of searching for information, right? And every contact that she has with a returning individual gives her new information, and every contact with another ant gives her old, not new information. And so this positive negative side of interactions, social interactions, and the latency period between positive interactions is what drives their decision making. And so what I wanted to do, because I'm not an empiricist, is to say, okay, what might be the consequence of this this sort of strategy on the colony behavior? So I developed a very simple mathematical model, again, to look at the colony level dynamic and sort of assuming foragers behave using an analogous decision rule. And for those who study epidemic type models, and this might look very familiar. So you've got a available pool of individuals at the nest who are waiting, right? And they get an interaction with a returning forager, and that at some rate beta, and that stimulates them to go out to forage. While they're out foraging, they might get lost or die at some per capita rate, but they also find food, right, at some rate alpha, and then after some period, they become returning foragers, and then can they return back into the system? Okay, so it's a classic SEI type of thing: susceptible, exposed, infected, and then back in. Okay, but the ecology of the ants motivates this other dynamic here, that the individuals are not just waiting forever, right? So the colony has other things to do other than forage, right? And so when individuals show up into the nest entrance area, and they're not getting enough information, they might cycle back in, right? And so I introduced this response function parameterized with this parameter omega, which I'm going to call the adaptive response factor. And it's this term here sort of gives you the relationship, how the number of available foragers changes or increases in response to the return of new foragers. Okay, and this parameter turns out to be quite important, as you will see in the analysis. Okay, so if you look at how if you look at this function, this retirement function, it turns out that it influences behavior of the model a lot. Okay, so first case is when omega is equal to 0. This might be the null model, assuming that there is no adaptive response. That foragers don't necessarily base the amount of time they spend in the waiting on returning foragers, that it has no influence. There's sort of no memory effect. In this case, the rate at which the number of foragers in the system become available is constantly decreasing, and the reason for this is, again, this is an SEI type of dynamic. As returning foragers enter the nest, they're going to reduce or deplete the pool of available foragers because of that, of the interactions. Okay, so the gray part here shows you the feasible side of this function, and it's constantly decreasing. On the other hand, if omega is greater than 0, then you have a region here where the rate of the availability of foragers at the nest actually increases before it starts decreasing. So again, that omega plays an important role on the dynamics of the system. So what about potential outcomes? So equilibrium of omega is greater than 0. There are 3 possible states the colony can end up in. Obviously, there's a no foraging state, equilibrium where there's only there's some baseline rate of ratio of available forages at the nest who are coming in at rate K1. Sorry, I didn't define those parameters, but anyways, there's some number of forages at the nest, and the colony is not foraging. Okay, and then there are 2 interior equilibria. One of them you can show is always unstable, and the other one is potentially stable depending on these threshold conditions, which really you can boil down to these 2 here. So the first one I'm going to call R naught. R naught is, again, familiar for people who study epidemiological models. It's the average number of new forages produced via recruitment or discovery over the length of a typical foraging period. And you can sort of decompose R naught, right? This is a theoretical quantity, into these 2 factors here. One is beta K1 or K2. So this ratio here turns out to be the baseline ratio of available forages at the nest, right? And then beta is sort of the intensity factor. So again, this is sort of the rate at which you push forages get pushed out in the best case scenario if you just say you had 1 returning forager. And then this other piece here is convoluted, but you can explain it just as outside factors, so sort of the environment, okay? And R naught is going to be influenced, as the environment changes, your R naught is going to be, might fluctuate over time if you think about, again, the biological context that the model is supposed to be describing. The other factor that's important is this one here, RA. So again, it's still composed of this intensity factor, but it has this additional term of availability. So this gives you the ratio of foragers outside versus inside. So if RA is greater than 1, for instance, then the intensity which you push foragers out is always greater than the rate at which foragers get back and they become available to be recruited. Okay, so again, this term here is going to be an important factor, because if you think about it, for this dynamic to work, you have to balance having enough forages at the nest in order to continue this cycle of foraging, so that there's individuals who get interacted with and then can leave and then come back. Okay, so what are the potential consequences of this? Well, the models predicts that there are 2 kinds of bifurcations that occur. So backwards bifurcation, when RA is less than 1, creates a region for R0 less than 1 where there's bistability, right? And in the second case, you just have the standard forward bifurcation. But again, if you're trying to interpret what this means for a colony, you can evaluate this from a risk perspective, right? So whether or not colonies, what is the trade-off basically of using a strategy that is risk averse versus risk prone, right? So sort of the sensitivity to changes or fluctuations in the R naught is the trade-off of these 2 strategies. So here you might be able to get more forages outside of the nest, and when times are good, but in an environment where there's a lot of fluctuations, that might not be a good strategy. Okay, so if you take this perspective, one might then be interested in trying to understand what parameters the colonies or might be under selective pressure for colonies to regulate. And again, it's just a standard sensitivity analysis, and it turns out, no surprise, it's omega, right? And so what this figure is showing here is that, again, the region of bistability, so of bistability in the system, where there's, again, this buffer for R naught increases with values of omega. And so, just to recap what we've talked about here. So again, Barbados faced a trade-off between, again, it needs to be balanced, that flexibility, being able to respond to changes like the arrival of new food items in the environment, but also not being susceptible because of their strategy to fluctuations. And what this model really try to get at is to understand what factors, what parameters might influence this balance. But again, this is just a colony level view. So it's important because we know that there is variation between colonies and how they regulate their activity. This thing is popping off, unfortunately. Okay. Sorry about that, people who are listening over this thing. So that's important in and of itself. But it still doesn't get at the question of homogeneity, right? So we know that foragers individually vary, and this is something that's been shown empirically, and it's not exactly clear how the variation at the individual level corresponds to the ability of colonies to successfully regulate their activity. And so one of the things that we do know, for instance, is that ants can change their movement rates to keep a constant rate of interactions, right? And then we also know that the thresholds for responding to different stimuli might change as a consequence of experience. And so these are things that you looking to develop further. Again, using more appropriate approaches like agent-based models to examine how the distribution of variance of types in the colony and the group will influence its ability to balance and in response to different kinds of environment. Okay? All right. So that was the first project. Questions? No. Okay, good. All right. Part 2. So like I said earlier, pogos are cool because, yes, they exist as colonies, eusocial colonies, which I just described, and they have to, respond to their environment. But for part of their life cycle, they live, or the queens live in communal associations. And what are these? These are groups with other queens who are not related to them. And they do so for the purpose of starting a colony. And it's a classic problem or question of cooperation among non-kin. All the issues that arise of the trade-off of individual benefit or individual cause versus group benefit show up very nicely in the system. That's why it's cool to study. And there are different tasks associated with starting a colony, like excavation and brood care, and it's not exactly clear what mechanisms underlie how the group gets allocated. Queens get allocated to different tasks. And so what we do to study this system at ASU every summer in July, like clockwork, except in the last decade, because we have that data, the colonies fly on July 4th, but not anymore. It's now a bit, I know. So they fly on July 4th, and we rush out. This is an area map of the area near the San Diego Valley, and there are a variation of types in this valley. So there are queens who are normally social and do what I just described, cooperative associations, and then there are queens who are solitary and go by themselves. And so it's another research question to examine, like what is the mechanism behind this population level pattern? But obviously to understand that, you need to start with the individual level, what's happening within the colonies. But anyway, so the queens, they have a mating flight. And once they're mated, typically the queens mate with about many males. I forget what the exact number is, but you need the variation. And once she's mated, she's going to fly down, chew off her wings, and then try to find a safe spot in the soil to start digging a nest. Okay? And that's where we come in. We rescue them from their fate because we do know that mortality is about 95% for colonies that are starting in the field. So we come in and we take the queens right before they go into their holes, and we bring them back to the lab and we paint them and put them in very nice comfortable chambers, ant farms. And we do this because it's cool and it's fun and undergrads love it, but also to do science, right? Like we would like to understand what the effect of the social environment is on the expression of the different of different behaviors, like what tasks the queens decide to do, and eventually whether or not the nest is successful at raising offspring. Okay, and so this is what the nest looks like. And you've got these nice little tunnels that get excavated out. Like we didn't do this, that's them, right? And the chambers all have a function. So the lowest chamber typically contains the brood, as you can see down here, right? And then they might have chambers where they keep their seeds, which we feed them periodically during experiments, right? And this is a nest with 2 queens, and you can see that one of them here is tending brood, and then this one up here is puzzled. And I think part of the reason it's puzzled is because it has no way to get out. And there's a reason for that, because I did that. That's one of the things that happened while I was taking this picture. The tunnels collapsed, right? And so thinking about the broader context of work showing up when you don't expect it, right? You've got babies that need to be taken care of right here, but also stuff happens from the outside that the colony needs to respond to, like someone broke our nest and we can't get out anymore. And so it's, again, important to understand how they're able to regulate or change their behavior in response to these perturbations is going to be important. At least that's the idea. Okay, so division of labor appears spontaneously when we study these systems. So we know that, for instance, if you take a solitary individual, right, and look at, this is the number of excavation trips per hour, and you look at them in pairs, you get this amplification, right? So the individual who was excavating at this level increases, and the one at the lower level decreases, right? And the same is true if you do different pairing. So if you take, this is a case where you had both queens were high frequency excavators in their old nests, right? And you replace them, you still get the amplification. And the biggest difference occurs when you take a high frequency and a low frequency individual. Okay, and so what's the mechanism behind this? So the idea, again, from that response threshold concept I discussed earlier in the talk, is that queens vary in the initial propensity to excavate. There's a reason for this, because we know that excavation is costly. So from this same data, we know that individuals who specialize in excavation actually have worser outcomes in terms of survival. But anyways, so they vary in the propensity to excavate, but the variance get amplified within groups. Again, through this dynamic I described of when I do a task, it necessarily means that the other person doesn't see the task, or the other individual doesn't see the task. And in doing so, you can get this divergent effect. So it's a social dynamic that might be driving this. One of the interesting patterns there is when you compare solitary and social queens, right? And on average, we see that the solitary queens seem to have higher skew, higher levels of division of labor than the solitary ones, which is interesting, right? People who have studied division of labor in other contexts would imagine that division of labor is supposed to increase productivity, so social groups should divide labor, but typically don't imagine the cost of doing that. So that's one ultimate explanation for this pattern that you're seeing up here, that why social queens. Yes, go ahead.
When you say division of labor is higher among solitary queens, do you put solitary queens together?
Yes.
So they're no longer solitary, but they would.
Right. So this is precisely. Yeah. So that's a really good question, because one of the reasons why we do that is to sort of get at the effects to remove any confounding effects of selection. So like any strategies that might have evolved to dictate their behavior in groups. So you just want to look at the effects of the environment without any, for queens who don't have any history of this.
What do you use to distinguish between a solitary versus a social queen?
It's also a good question. So like I said, there's variation at the population level. So we know in California, which is where this data comes from, we know that there are populations where the queens don't do. They don't form social associations. And so when we get them back, we just tag them. So we pick from different populations and then
So
we,
experimentally you mix them,
yes.
but in nature you wouldn't see that.
Yes, but these populations, they exist on boundaries. And so as I was showing here, right? So like there are regions where you just see all of this, right? But if you go in this region, it's about half and half. And so, ultimately this is the pattern that we would like to understand, right? But so this is just, again, a way to get at, again, what might be the incipient condition. The first time this happened is what we're trying to recreate in the labs. Yeah. Okay, good questions. All good? Everybody? All right. So, so these are ultimate questions. And so, but before, I'm not an empiricist at all. I'm a modeler. And before, trying to understand these patterns, you want to understand what the proximate mechanisms that are producing them. So I went back and re-examined this idea of a response threshold, which had already existed in models before I started working on this. And if you think about it, a response threshold is, it's just not a number, right? Like there's a reason for that. It depends on the factors you assume influence your decision to do X versus Y, right? That's gonna shape your threshold for in this case, tasks, right? And so you can imagine these different factors, right? So both the external environment, like the stimulus perceived, whether or not there's variation in how the inqueens perceive different stimuli, right? But internally, there's also the factors of the behavioral or the motivational state. Resting, particularly in this system, is something that's going to be functional, right? Or from an energetic perspective, that individuals who are consistently active, for instance, will pay a cost. And so there should be pressure to at least regulate your activity in the absence of work, right? So, and also effects of like experience. And so what I decided to do is build a model, general model that could try to understand, that incorporate these different factors and try to understand how the dynamics of the probability of performing different tasks will be influenced by these thresholds, and how these different parameters might influence it. Okay? And so here's the model. This is not quite the model, but this is the description of the state variables in the model. Okay, so you imagine a group with n agents and m tasks and +1, sort of the internal state of each agent, right? We assume that the agents, again, we're not dealing with strategic interactions here. They're just myopic. They respond to work in the environment and influence each other's probability of performing the task by affecting the stimulus. Okay? So I'm going to keep track of two variables here, x, the probability of performing the task at time t, and then s of j is the stimulus, or you can think of it as the demand for work in that task at that time. Okay. So how do agents treat tasks? And we're going to assume, like I hinted at earlier, that there are these two competing factors. There's internal pressures, so think of it as constraints or costs of being active that the agent is trying to balance, and then there are external demands, like that influence the likelihood of performing on different tasks. And the external factors, the external demands, I'm going to model very simply as just the value of the stimulus for each task, Sj, and it's going to be weighted by some preference parameter for each agent I for task J. Okay? And I've written this as a preference, but you can also think of it as aversion, depending on whether or not depending on how you feel. It's like, I hate doing that task. This is your parameter. Okay? M, how does the environment change? Quite simply. So work comes in at a constant rate, delta, right? And then work gets done. Imagine these queens, like, they moving the soil, or they are feeding the brood, and so the stimulus goes down with the total amount of work times multiplied by the probability, multiplied by the work rate of each agent and on the task, okay? quite simple. And then you could sort of think about what's the underlying mechanism for choice, for how queens decide, and how they encounter a task and decide whether or not they should change their behavior. So what I was imagining in developing this model was like an adaptive dynamics, like reinforcement learning algorithm, where queens encounter tasks randomly, and then they switch to different states, right? So for instance, task, or they might rest with a probability proportional to the difference between the utilities, or the value, this value function that I described for each state. Okay, so if you sort of, so if you're in that world, you can then try to come up with a model to describe the probability, the state probabilities for each queen and each task, and how that might evolve over time. And that's just the inflow from less value alternatives, the difference between that and the average, the weighted average of all the other states, and then the outflow to the other ones again. This is again the decomposed version. But anyways, so if you pass on a limit and try to think of the system now, this thing working in continuous time, you then get a system of ordinary differential equations, which looks like this. And the first term here is this is the rate of change of xij with respect to time. The first term here, so the first term here is the value of performing task j, right, which I defined by this quantity here. Just the stimulus weighted by the preference parameter. And then this is the average value of all the other states. And I've described that here. Okay, and so you put it all together, you have a system that looks like this. Okay. All right. So if you have the system, there might be some, we'd like to understand its behavior, its dynamics, and potential equilibrium outcomes. And so one of the first things you do is, we can come up with a definition, make things easier to understand our results. So I'm going to define X as the equilibrium matrix. The first row here is going to correspond for each agent. This is sort of your null probability of not doing anything. So for agent 1, x10 is that, and then the vector here from 1 to m is probability distribution across all the different task states. And then you can then look at the whole matrix. This is equilibrium matrix, or would then describe the different allocation outcomes that you can see in the system. Okay. Another definition we're going to make, so that an agent is a complete specialist for the task, right down here, if they perform that task they only perform that task with positive probability, and that's it. Okay. And then an agent is a generalist if that's not true. Okay. And then in between, we will not care about that for now. Okay. So given that definition, one question one might be interested in is like, what are the potential configurations that you can get in terms of whether or not, how many individuals, what's the probability that you have all individuals performing performing every task, or some of them not performing any task. And then what you can, motivated by that, there's this theorem, which you can show that, assuming agents have unique preferences, that there is no interior equilibrium. So the equilibrium matrix always has, for each task, there's at least one agent who is either going to be a complete specialist on the task or inactive. But you're never going to get a equilibrium configuration where every agent has positive probability on every task. Okay? And so thinking about what the biological interpretations of that result is, it's like a division of labor, right? There's always going to be one individual who's like, has a higher probability of performing the task, and there's going to be individuals who are slackers. Again, depending on the ranking of the preferences. Yes.
Sorry, is that a constraint to the model, or is it an
So we observed that division of labor does show up in the system, and
The
I
fact that,
in
no equilibrium state where the group works on every task.
yeah.
That's,
So yes, that is actually yes. I understand your question now. So that is a constraint on the model, on the assumption that I've made in the model, and I will discuss what happens when you relax that assumption in the subsequent slide. Yes. Other questions? Okay.
So the minimum says that agent one does everything at some non-zero value.
Uh-huh.
And then agent of class two is either inactive or active at one activity.
Right. So each task at equilibrium, you must have one individual who has some probability of performing it. And that is not, yeah, so again, this is not unique. There are permutations of that, but the basic idea here is that you can have one elitist, if you want to think about it that way, who does everything and doesn't rest. Don't know what that is. Again, another constraint, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you can have each agent, one agent performing every task, and every agent sort of like slotted in on every other task. So that's the minimum and the maximum. Okay. All right. So those are the potential equilibrium configurations. That doesn't tell you anything about stability. Turns out it's a really difficult problem to prove general stability conditions for general M and N. So what you can decide to do is just investigate reasonable cases, right? So I'm going to talk about that in a second, but first I'm going to tell you about this threshold conditions which showed up everywhere when I was doing this analysis, right? And it's just the balance between the external demand and the preference for each agent. So delta J over alpha ij is the sort of the maximum equilibrium demand for the task, assuming agent I is the only one performing task J, right? And so the ratio between this and her, in these theta ij and phi I, which describe her internal state, both her preference and for the task and her the cost of activity. These are the things going to influence whether or not she's performing the task at equilibrium. Okay, so just to hammer home that point, simple example, one agent, one task, right? Two-dimensional system, super easy. You have two equilibria. One of them, well, there's a threshold condition, which turns out to just be delta J, so delta 1 divided by alpha 1 times phi 1. So when that's greater than 1, the agent performs the task with positive probability. When it's less than 1, she performs the task in proportion to that. And in terms of the dynamics, it turns out the first case, it's a node. So when it's greater than 1, you have a saddle node. And when it's less than 1, it's a spiral. And again, this makes sense because of the dynamic that I assumed of how agents are responding, sort of trying to balance the value of performing, in this case, of performing the task and resting is what generates the oscillatory behavior. Okay, but it's stable. So in general, this system, if you assume that agents have equal preferences and that they're not influenced by anything else, it has equilibrium dynamics. So it's, for instance, in the case of two agents, one task, right? And so what I mean by equilibrium dynamics is that it always converges to some steady state that is non-oscillatory. So in the case of two agents, one task, you have actually 7 equilibria because of the symmetry of the system. You only need to look at 4, right? Because it's just the other 3 are reverse, each agent. The agent's reverse roles. But anyways, if you look at the bifurcations in the system, you again see that they're in fact transcritical. So on the y-axis here, I'm showing the equilibrium demand for the task, and the x-axis here, I'm showing the ratio of both the demand, the need for work, divided by the agent's the more efficient, sorry, not the more efficient agent, the agent who is, who has less to lose, I should say. So that's what this means, right? So if agent one, if phi 1, 1, phi 1, if theta 1, 1, phi 1 is larger than theta 2, 1, phi 2, what this means is that agent 1 has greater inertia, kind of, and that means that agent 2, and that means she has greater to lose, and then agent 2 is going to be more active to perform the task. Okay, and so this is the world that we're in, and you can sort of look at the bifurcations of the system in this world, and you should see as you increase both the either the demand for work, or in this case, if the agent is also efficient on the task, you go from a case where the agent is the first agent is inactive, to a case over here where both agents are performing the task with positive with unit probability. Okay, and the threshold conditions are these dotted lines, right? For each agent, they're like thresholds for when it's malvaluable to do it. Okay, so for 2 agents, 2 tasks, it's complicated, right? You've got up to 24 states, 12 really, again, because of the symmetry. But what I'm going to do here is get at your question to say what happens if the agents don't agree on the task. So what happens if they don't have equal preference, if they have equal preferences across tasks? So there's no difference, there's no variation in the perceived cost of doing it, of performing the task. And if that happens, you have a potential now of having interior equilibria, right? So that constraint that I imposed earlier, when I remove it, I get new dynamics, or new behavior. First, I have interior equilibria, and I also have new dynamics because there's now a potential for bistability in the system. So this bifurcation diagram shows the net stimulus for work at equilibrium for both tasks, right? And this is the, I think here we're still assuming that agent, the first agent has greater inertia than the second agent. And I'm also now assuming that agent 1 is more efficient at a task than agent 2, then vice versa. And what you can see is that as the amount of work in the system increases, you get the same transcritical thing, bifurcation pops up, right? So there are thresholds when both agents switch from an equilibrium here, where the second agent is the first agent is inactive, to one where, oh, I take that back. So 0. Okay, so you switch from equilibrium where the first agent is working on the first task at some lower probability, to this one here where the first agent is now working with unit probability, right? So that's E10, and then the E01 is the second agent working on the second task, right? And then down here, the same thing, but these are bifurcations of the interior equilibria. But one thing that's interesting to know is that these curves occur at different places, right? So what does that mean? That the net workload in the system down here is lower than up here. So in the case here where you have sort of a division of labor where the first agent only works exclusively on the first task and the second agent works on the second one, right? You actually end up with a higher level of workload than down here where both of them, right? And so that's makes sense. That's because I assume the agents that the efficiency on each task was related to their initial performance on that task. But you can actually flip the script, right? And that's what I'm showing this picture here. So now we assume that the agents are actually inefficient on the task that they start on. And if that's the case, there's a potential for the system to end up at a place where agents who are not so good at a task get stuck working on the task, and the workload in the system is higher than down here where they're actually working on their most efficient task. Okay? And so what are the biological implications of the model? Among many, it's a general framework, and you can sort of play with it and add other terms or other components to For instance, the effects of agents directly on, on the experience on these agents' performance of different tasks, or direct effects of like competition between the agents. But what this null model shows is that just by assuming that not assuming any interactions between agents directly and only the environment, that you can get cases where initial conditions do matter. And that's interesting insight in trying to understand this pattern that we see of why there's different skew between solitary and social queens, and provides some it provides a platform for us to start trying to understand why these patterns show up. Okay, and this is related to some of the more interesting work that I'm looking at now in the future, is to go back into the data, right, and try to relate outcomes of both division of labor in this case to the dynamics, right? So what you're looking at here is the time series of average of social queens, and I've differentiated queens who are highly who are specializing on excavation in the data, and queens who were in, so this is a 2-queen nest, so a pair, and queens who specialize on excavation, and queen who were specializing on brood care, and you're looking at the proportion of time spent on these 2 different tasks. And what you can see is that, in fact, there are correlations, and there are things that are hidden in this time series that I think might be useful for a model and to understand predictions. So for instance, you can imagine that over time, so this is in days, right, that the amount of work in the system changes. So starting from when there are no eggs available, and as eggs start to develop, the amount of work increases, and that's why you're seeing brood care. But the larvae have different stages. So for instance, you know, the eggs transition into larvae and pupae, which have different demands during those stages. So in the larvae stage, there's more demand potentially than in the pupae stage. And so that might explain some of the variation that you're seeing up here. But this is only preliminary work. So I'm open to suggestions about how we can, how people see this type of data and how they might be used with the model I just described to understand these patterns. Okay. So one of the other things that I'm interested in is about the system is relating division of labor outcomes to productivity outcomes. Okay, so what you're seeing here is a graph of these are the social queens in different pairings, and looking at how much eggs they produce and comparing it to how much workers they produce. And what we observed in the data is that social pairs tend to have higher work efficiency than non-social ones. And so it's an interesting observation, because we know that the division of labor doesn't necessarily correspond, or at least it was evenly social pairs, their division of labor numbers were all over the place. They had different levels of skew, so it's not necessarily clear what's producing or produced this efficiency pattern. So that's an interesting ultimate question. And to get at that, what we decided to do is go back and study the non-social queens, so taking queens who are, again, normally solitary and forcing them into associations. And the reason why we do this is to try and understand why or how these outcomes are shaped, not by selection, but by emergent effects that show up when these queens were initially forced together in nature. Okay, and so that's what these experiments can tell us. And so looking at Barbados queens who are normally solitary, groups of 1 to 6 queens, and when we put them in groups, what we found out is that first, that division of labor increased with group size, which will make sense because of this idea of amplification initial differences in task propensities, coupled with the fact that when you have more individuals in the group, there's less work to do, right? But one of the other interesting things that I noticed is that the excavation specialists were generally more active on work not related to, on activities not related to work in the colony. So we classify these as non-task, right? And the brood care specialists, right, were less active in non-tasks. In fact, they spent more time on self-care or resting or grooming than the queens who were specializing on excavation. So that's an interesting pattern. When we look at productivity, what we observed is that that groups with 4 or more queens laid less eggs per capita, right? And this is the average number of eggs observed in the nest per capita, and then over the first 12 days. And we see here that there was a drop off at day 10, and the reason for that is obviously due to the hatching of larvae, but also due to cannibalism, which is something that has been observed before on the species. And then when you look at productivity, that's where something interesting happens. So the black bars are eggs, and I already explained this. So per capita productivity is decreasing with group size, right? But in terms of outcomes, so how many eggs turn into workers, we saw that the pairs were doing much better than the groups of with 4 or more queens. So this is looking at all the nests that survived up to day 55. The average number of of workers was higher among paired queens. Okay, so when we try to, and this part of the talk is me going into data to trying to elicit a mechanism that might explain this. So again, if you have disagreements, that's fine. I'm happy to hear them. Okay, but one thing I did notice is if you look at the correlation, for instance, between the fraction of time, if you look at correlation between number of offspring per capita, and you regress it on the proportion of time as a group spent on brood care, no surprise, there's a significant effect, a positive effect. And on the other hand, if you look at the individuals or groups that are spending more time not working on these non-tasks, there's a negative effect. So that's explained by that. But the effect for division of labor was not there. So division of labor did not necessarily predict who was producing, who had the most offsprings on the nest. Okay, so what might be driving the pattern, the optimal size of per capita productivity that we saw with group size? Well, one possibility has to do with the variance. So if you think about what the work of brood care, part of that involves feeding and keeping the brood happy, and also to prevent cannibalism, like I said, which does happen as larvae tend to cannibalize eggs if they're not separated. So that's one place where this is interesting. And so the variability of work, and by this I mean how the constancy of work might be something that's important to understanding why nests vary in their outcomes. And so I went into data to try and characterize this effect. So I looked at the variance in work output for the first week when we had the behavioral observations to see, over the first 7 days, we had 8 hours of data for each day, what the relationship was between the variability of work and the variance in brood output 2 weeks into the association, and how that related with the number of offspring, per capita number of offspring after 6 weeks. And so the expectation is that if the variance is bad, then you're going to expect to see that nests are doing poor. Then your next with more variance in output have less output, more variance in work output have less brood, less larvae, and then that's going to in fact influence their per capita productivity along the line. So this is what the trend was. These things were not, these data were not significant. These models, I didn't get a significant relationship looking at this, but the trend is interesting and one that I thought might be useful to explore with a model. The other thing that was interesting when I looked at the data was that queens tend to show a form of behavioral, I'll call it fidelity. So on the time scale of hours, even though I told you that we got different division of labor where queens specialize on different tasks, if you look on the time scale of hours, you saw those oscillations. So the periods of activity tend to be followed by more periods of activity, and periods when they were resting tend to be followed by more periods when they were resting. So there is sort of this consistency on the time scale of hours at the individual, which may suggest some form of adaptive dynamic, similar to what I discussed in the previous project. And so here's a hypothesis that I'm going to test with a model. Okay, that queens are available to perform tasks, and that task interactions cause them to be more available. So so if you imagine this as a search process, where if I find a task to work on, I'm more likely to stay active to work on it, versus queens who don't find anything to do tend to sort of conserve resources and then become inactive. And this is sort of the basic dynamic happening at the individual level. So we'd like to understand what the consequences is of this rule is on division of labor and the variability of work when you add more individuals into the group. Okay? So I tested this. You just built a very dingy agent-based model, right? And so the basic idea here is that the queens encounter tasks with some probability, which may depend on their experience, their previous experience. So they might be more likely to encounter recently performed tasks, and that's a parameter in the model. And then the other important piece of the model is that individuals who don't perform tasks during each period, they have an increased likelihood of staying inactive in the next period. Okay, and so there's this variable here. Where is it? Tau. Okay, so tau is the variable that describes for each queen the effect of working versus not. So if during periods when she's idle, tau increases and says, I didn't find anything to do, so I'm less motivated in the next time period. And during periods when she's working, it decreases because she's more motivated to find work. Okay, so a very similar dynamic to what I've explored in the previous model. But now I'm looking at the effects of group size. Okay, so in the first panel here, first result, on the y-axis, I'm showing you the variance in the stimulus for the two tasks in the system, right? For task 1, task 2, net over the course of simulations. So I did about 50 simulations, and these are the averages of the variability of the stimulus. Okay, is what I'm looking at. And so each of the lines denote a group size of n, so a group of 1 individual up to 6, and then each point shows for different levels, different probabilities of encountering most recent task. Okay, and the idea behind this parameter is that queens might vary in their propensity to explore the nests versus when individuals that tend to be more segregated, as you saw in that picture in the chambers. And so this parameter is just supposed to be modeling that effect. So the first thing that you notice is that if you just take a slice, just looking at one line, when rho is equal to 0.5, the queens have equal probability of encountering both tasks. And so this is what you expect in the null model, that as you increase group size going down, the variance in workout and the variability of the stimulus of work decreases, right? So this is the null model, right? But there's also an effect of your propensity to perform different tasks. So there's actually places where if you, for instance, encounter if you tend to encounter your most recent task with some greater than chance probability, your variance actually decreases for different levels, with different levels, different size of groups. Okay, so this is the case where C equals 0 is the case where you have no feedback between the queen's experience and again, so there's no dynamic between, this dynamic is not there yet, but this is sort of the null model. Okay, but the basic result here is that in this case, that productivity is increasing with group size if productivity is defined as the variability of work in the system. Okay. The second case is where I've implemented the dynamic I just described, wherein queens tend to base their probability, the probability of remaining active increases with their experience performing tasks. In this case, you get a flip, right? So the lines here show that the group with the lowest variance in work output is the, in this case, is a group of 2 for different parameters. But the basic idea here is, though, is that in larger groups, what happens is if you start the system with so many individuals, work gets done, okay? And when work gets done, you don't find anything to do. And when you don't find anything to do, you're like, oh, there's nothing to do. And then you go to sleep, right? And then work shows up. And then it takes some time, right, for individuals to realize that there's work to be done. And so this is what happens in the larger groups, that it's sort of a crowding effect, that it takes away chances of individual queens performing tasks, and in doing so, it increases their inactivity. And when work shows up, they are not there, and so you have higher variance in work output. And this is obviously mitigated in lower groups, and you can also see an effect of the propensity to perform different tasks. And so it's an interesting, it's a dingy little model, and it provides some explanation. I'm gonna have to slide back here for a second. It provides an explanation for some of the things that we see in the data. So for instance, that you don't have that yet, but we can see that inactivity tends to increase in larger groups, right? And then that there's variance between individuals who specialize on different tasks in the propensity to be active versus remain active. And it's, again, purely hypothesis at this point. But again, there's some predictions made by the model, which we can go back in the experiments or test with new experiments to see if this dynamic is actually at play in the system. Okay. All right. So final slide, just a conclusion, that these foundry associations, they are interesting for many reasons. First, because they're an example of cooperation among non-kin, right? And that the trade-offs of performing a task that's beneficial for yourself, but that's costly to you but beneficial for the group, is going to influence both the fitness of the individual and the group, and then have opportunity for strategic behaviors to evolve. And so by studying these force associations, we can sort of understand how these behaviors are influenced in the absence of any type of a repertoire to respond to social or for any repertoire for strategic interactions that might occur in a completely social species. And when we study these non-cooperative groups or non-social groups, what we see is that the size and mix of the group does matter. And influences both the propensity to perform different tasks, and we know that influences that affect, like individuals who specialize in excavation have survival costs associated with it, right? And then these effects might affect productivity, again, just through a dynamic where queens are wanting to conserve energy. In larger groups, you can just get an effect on the variance and the variability of work, and that might be costly for larger groups, okay? And all of this was done without necessarily invoking any type of strategic behavior, but obviously because these systems have evolved these social systems, there must be some mechanism to minimize the skew in costs. And so, and that's sort of where I see this work going, in trying to understand how these systems evolve and are maintained, and what are the strategies that individual queens might be using to regulate their behavior within groups, so that they have a higher chance of surviving these associations. Okay? All right, so that's it. Acknowledgments. I would like to thank, I'd say all of this work was done over the course of 3 years at Arizona State. My mentors there were Dr. Yun Kang and Professor Jennifer Fuel, and also my collaborator at UCLA, Noah Pinto-Woolman. They were very helpful. I also like to acknowledge grant support from these two organizations who funded all of these projects. So, without further ado, I will take questions. Let me see here. All right, questions.
So in the model, you talked about preference, but
Yes.
do you have any evidence that these ants have preference, or can you offer anything that will make me believe that they have a preference for a certain task?
No, well, that's a good question. I use the word preference. You know, the model was described, it was supposed to be general, right? And preferences might evolve from a strategic perspective. It will make sense if you if you had a preference for a brood care, less expensive task, and also maybe you might eat some of the eggs of the other queen. That might be useful, right? Rather than excavation. And so in the model, I think what was interesting in the model, though, was when I removed that assumption of preferences, how it showed that differences in initial conditions. So your initial propensity to perform a task you could end up with different allocations, ones that were more efficient than other ones. And so to answer your question, I don't think that for these ants, I don't think they should have any preferences in the asocial system, right? Because you don't want to develop a preference for excavation rather than brood care. You need all the tasks. Those kinds of things might evolve in a more social one due to competitive interactions, or even at the group level. Like, it could be that if there's a mechanism to coordinate specialists to their most efficient task, then it will make sense to evolve preferences. But for this system, I don't think that preferences are appropriate for the non-social queens. Yeah.
As I understand it, the temperature has some effect upon the amount of labor that an ant can do. What do you see as the role of temperature and the changing temperature in sort of the stability of some of these systems? And is that have been something that you have explored?
Not directly, but it's something I've observed. First context, again, doing these foundry associations. So I was out in California for 2 years. And, you know, like I said, in the summer, trying to observe how, trying to collect these ants. And, you know, we used looking at the data from the past 10 plus years. There's a regularity that seemed to be, I've gone askew. And Jen has been doing this for more than that, at least 15, 20 years. So temperature is something that's influencing the ecology. And then in terms of, so that's in terms of the second project, the Foundry Association. The first project, looking at how foraging, how colonies respond to variation in temperature. It's something I'm interested in. Also my collaborator, Noah, is, especially in the desert, where rainfall is not as frequent. And so, yeah, there are interesting questions to think about there in terms of like how different and how colonies can adapt to different changes. Like, you might specialize, for instance, on being very efficient at collecting food when times are good, but that's not so good if you have there's rapid changes in the environment. So, yeah, as I said in my discussion, I'm quite interested in understanding the effects of variation within the colony on how, for instance, how they might regulate the foraging activity. So I think it's important.